Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin.
The Phoenix Lights. Tonight, we're going to the desert southwest, Arizona, where on one particular evening in March 1997, something moved through the night sky that nobody has fully explained in the nearly 3 decades since. This is the complete story of the Phoenix Light. Chapter 1: The Desert, the Sky, and the long history of watching. Arizona is one of the oldest continuously inhabited landscapes on the North American continent. The Hohokam people built canals through the Salt River Valley more than 2,000 years ago. Sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed civilization to bloom in what is otherwise one of the most brutally arid environments in the Western Hemisphere. The word Hohokam, in the language of the Akimel O'odham people who came after them, is sometimes translated as those who have gone before, or those who have vanished. The Hohokam disappeared around the 15th century, and no one is entirely sure why. What they left behind are the outlines of a great canal system that the modern city of Phoenix was built on top of, almost as if the new civilization had grown like a vine over the old skeleton of one that came before. The Phoenix metropolitan area takes its name from this idea of regeneration, of rising from the ruins of something ancient. It was named by an early settler named Darrell Dupa, a well-read Englishman who looked at the ruins of the Hohokam canals and saw the myth of the phoenix bird, the creature that burns to ash and is reborn. The city was officially incorporated in 1881, and by 1997, it had grown into the 6th largest city in the United States, a sprawling grid of suburbs and highways and strip malls spreading outward from a downtown core with about 3 million people living in the greater metropolitan area. The sky above Phoenix is by most account extraordinary because the valley sits at roughly 1,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by mountain ranges, the McDowell Mountains to the north, the Superstition Mountains to the east, the Sierra Estrella range to the southwest, and South Mountain anchoring the bottom of the valley. The horizons are dramatic. On a clear night, the darkness at the edge of the valley is genuine. The mountains simply absent shapes against the stars. The air is almost always dry. Clouds are seasonal. For most of the year, the sky is simply open. The people of the desert southwest have a long relationship with looking up. The ancestral Puebloans who built their cities into the cliff faces of the Colorado Plateau oriented their architecture towards celestial events with extraordinary precision. The Casa Grande ruins, about an hour south of Phoenix, contain circular holes in their walls that align with solar and lunar cycles in ways that archaeologists still study and argue about. Watching the sky was not merely a spiritual practice for these cultures. It was practical. The position of certain stars told you when to plant, when to harvest, when the rains would come. By 1997, of course, most people in the Phoenix area were not farmers checking the Pleiades for the timing of their corn planting. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives: doctors, construction workers, retirees, students, police officers, bartenders, pilots. But the impulse to watch the sky had not gone away, and in the spring of 1997, there was a particular reason to be watching. Chapter 2: The Comet That Brought Everyone Outside. Comet Hale-Bopp is worth lingering on because it is one of the reasons the Phoenix Lights were seen by as many people as there were, and because it captures something about the mood of that particular moment in time. Hale-Bopp was discovered independently and nearly simultaneously by two amateur astronomers, Alan Hale in New Mexico and Thomas Bopp in Arizona, on the night of July 23, 1995. When they reported their discovery to the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams, the comet was calculated to be an extraordinary 1,000 times brighter than Halley's Comet had been at the same distance from the Sun. Astronomers were excited. The general public, once word got around, was excited too. By early 1997, Hale-Bopp was becoming easily visible to the naked eye, and by March of that year, it had reached its perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun, on April 1st. The weeks surrounding that perihelion were the comet's brightest and most spectacular. Claude Haynes, a member of the East Valley Astronomy Club, described Hale-Bopp as one of the last big monster comets. It was, in the most literal sense, a once-in-a-lifetime event. Hale-Bopp's orbital period is approximately 4,000 years, which means no living human had ever seen it before, and no living human will ever see it again. When it comes back, it will be the year 6,000 something. Whatever civilization exists then will look up and see the same bright smear of light that people in Phoenix, Arizona were looking at in March of 1997. This matters because it means that on the evening of March 13, 1997, an unusually large number of people were already outside, already looking up, already had their eyes adjusted to the dark. Amateur astronomers had their telescopes set up in their backyards. Families were out on their patios. People had driven out to the edges of the city specifically to get away from the light pollution and get a better view. All of which meant that when something unusual appeared in the sky that night, there were more eyes to see it than there would have been on almost any other evening. But before we get to what comes next, there is something else that was on many people's mind in the spring of 1997, the strange, sad story of Heaven's Gate. Chapter 3: The Shadow of Heaven's Gate. On March 26, 1997, 13 days after the Phoenix Lights, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult were found dead in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They had died by suicide, believing that their souls would be transported to a spacecraft they believed was traveling in the wake of Comet Hale-Bopp. The cult leader Marshall Applewhite had convinced his followers that the Earth was about to be recycled and that the only way to survive was to shed their containers or their human bodies and ascend. This is deeply sad, and it is not the main story here, but it matters for understanding the cultural context of the Phoenix Light. When the story of the lights began to gain national attention in the weeks and months following March 13th, it was in the shadow of Heaven's Gate. The mainstream media, which had just spent days covering one of the most bizarre mass suicides in American history, a tragedy explicitly connected to comets and spacecraft and extraterrestrial belief, was not well positioned to take new claims of UFO sightings seriously. The association was uncomfortable. The timing was unfortunate, and it contributed, at least in part, to the way the story was initially handled or mishandled by the press, by officials, and by the government. This was also the mid-1990s. The X-Files was at the heights of its cultural dominance, with millions of viewers tuning in each week to follow FBI agents Fox Mulder and Dana Scully as they investigated paranormal phenomena and government conspiracies. The phrase, "I want to believe," had become a cultural shorthand for a whole set of attitudes about hidden truth, government secrecy, and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. UFO culture was simultaneously mainstream enough to be a hit television premise and fringe enough to be associated with people like Marshall Applewhite. This was the tightrope that anyone reporting on the Phoenix Lights had to walk. And yet, something had happened on March 13th, something that thousands of people had seen with their own eyes. Something had left them shaken and wondering and reaching for words to describe what they had experienced. Whatever it was real enough to generate hundreds of emergency calls, real enough to make a sitting governor privately question everything he thought he knew about the world above him, real enough to reshape the lives of the people who had seen it. So, we go back to March 13th, 1997, somewhere over Henderson, Nevada. At around 7:30 in the evening, the comet is visible. The sky is clear and moonless, and the first of what will become thousands of witnesses looks up and sees something else entirely. Chapter 4: The Night Itself. The first report of something unusual came from a man in Henderson, Nevada, at approximately 6:55 in the evening. Henderson is the city in Las Vegas metropolitan area, just across the state line from Arizona. The witness, whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, described seeing a V-shaped formation in the sky moving south. He was not the last person to see this shape. He was merely the first. Over the next 3 hours, the lights, or whatever it was that produced them, travel approximately 300 miles through the airspace of Nevada, Arizona, and into northern Mexico. The trajectory was broadly southeast, and the timeline can be reconstructed from hundreds of individual witness reports, phone calls, and later testimonies, creating a kind of flickering, pointillist portrait of something moving through the night. At approximately 8:15 in the evening, a former police officer in Powden, Arizona, reported seeing a cluster of orange lights in the sky. Powden is a small community in the high desert north of Prescott, at an elevation of around 4,000 feet, where the air is clear and the horizon is wide. The former officer, a trained observer by profession, watched the lights through binoculars as they moved through the sky. He tracked them until they disappeared below his line of sight to the south. 2 minutes later, around 8:17, multiple calls came into the Prescott Police Department. People in Prescott, a city of about 30,000, about 90 miles north of Phoenix, were seeing the same thing. They described white and reddish orbs. Some described a formation shaped like a boomerang. Some said it seemed to be headed south toward Phoenix. At 8:23, the lights were reported over Prescott Valley. The formation was moving steadily, unhurriedly, almost as if it were not in a hurry to be anywhere. Witnesses in Prescott Valley described the object as massive. One anonymous witness said it completely blocked out the stars in the area it covered. This detail would be repeated by many witnesses over the course of the evening. The lights were not simply lights against the sky. They appeared to be attached to something, some dark, enormous shape that swallowed the stars behind it. By around 8:30, the formation had reached the Dewey-Humboldt area, just south of Prescott Valley, and was continuing its unhurried southward journey. The lights were still being described as amber or orange-white, still arranged in a V or triangular pattern. By roughly 8:45, the formation had reached the outskirts of the Phoenix metropolitan area. This is when the sheer scale of the witness pool expanded dramatically, because Phoenix and its surrounding communities are home to millions of people, and many of them were outside that night looking at the comet. What had been a scattered series of reports from small communities in the high desert north of Phoenix suddenly became something much larger. Somewhere in this window, the precise time is uncertain, a private pilot was making his approach into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. He was flying a Cessna. He had his son with him, and as he came over the northern edge of the valley, he spotted 6 lights arranged in a perfect V formation hanging over the airport, motionless and silent in the night sky. He did what a responsible pilot does. He called it to air control. He reported the lights. He was professional and clear about what he saw. And then he landed, and the moment passed, and he largely forgot about it. The pilot was Kurt Russell, the actor and longtime aviation enthusiast. Russell had been a licensed pilot since the 1980s and flew regularly. He did not connect his air traffic control report to the growing story of the Phoenix lights until years later, when he was watching a documentary, and a voice in his head said, quietly, but with certainty, "I know who called that in." He went public with the story in 2017 during an appearance on BBC's The One Show, where he said, with characteristic dryness, "I'm going to declare it's unidentified. It's flying and it's 6 objects." He joked that he might have been the first official report of the night. He may well have been right. Meanwhile, across the valley, people were stepping outside, looking up, and being stopped cold. Chapter 5. What the Witnesses Saw. The sheer volume of witness testimony from the Phoenix lights is one of the things that separates it from almost every other UFO event in recorded history. A 1997 Rocky Mountain poll found that up to 10% of all Arizonians reported seeing the lights, which, given that the state's population at the time was approximately 4.5 million people, means somewhere in the neighborhood of 450,000 potential witnesses. Other estimates place the number of people who actually saw something at between 10,000 and 20,000, with some advocates putting the figures higher. The Mutual UFO Network's Arizona chapter would later say that the clear, moonless nature of the night significantly aided visibility. There was no ambient lunar glow to wash out dim lights, and the air was exceptionally transparent. What did they see? Their accounts are extraordinarily consistent, which is itself one of the most remarkable things about the Phoenix lights. When hundreds or thousands of people independently describe the same phenomenon, and their descriptions match the same shape, the same movement, the same silence, it is difficult to dismiss as collective hysteria or mass suggestion, particularly when many witnesses did not know others had seen the same thing until days or weeks later. The craft, if it was a craft, was described as enormous. The most frequently given estimate is that its wingspan was approximately a mile wide. Witnesses who saw it pass overhead described it as making the sky feel smaller, as if a ceiling had been lowered. The shape was consistently described as a V, or a triangle, or a chevron, a forward-pointing angle with lights arrayed along the leading edges or at distinct points. Some witnesses said there were 5 lights, some said 6, some said 7. This variation is not necessarily suspicious. It may reflect differences in angle of observation, the clarity of individual witnesses' views, and the natural variance in human perception. What almost every witness agreed on was the silence. This is the detail that strikes people most forcefully, even decades later. Not a hum, not a roar, not even the distant rumble that a large commercial aircraft produces when it is miles away. Nothing. An object, whatever it was, that appeared to be enormously large, moving through the sky at what witnesses estimated to be roughly 30 to 40 miles per hour, producing no sound whatsoever. In the quiet of a March evening in the desert, with no wind and no traffic noise in many of the areas where witnesses were standing, the silence was deafening in its absence. Dr. Lynn Katay was one of those witnesses. She is worth introducing here because she would go on to become the most tenacious and well-documented investigator of the Phoenix Lights, and her story begins not on March 13, 1997, but 2 years earlier. Dr. Katay was a physician, a highly regarded medical professional who worked as chief clinical consultant at the Arizona Heart Institute's Imaging Prevention Wellness Center in Phoenix. She and her husband lived in a house nestled into the mountains near the Arizona Biltmore, a resort and residential area in the northeastern part of the city with clear views across the valley. In 1995, Dr. Katay managed to photograph what she described as oval orbs arranged in the pyramid formation outside her home using a 35mm camera. In January of 1997, 2 months before the mass sighting, she filmed what she described as a mile-wide group of 6 lights hovering in the distance at roughly 1,000 feet over the Class B restricted airspace of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. She did not know what she was seeing. She told no one for years. On the evening of March 13, 1997, Dr. Katay looked out her bedroom window over the valley and saw the lights again, but this time on an incomparably larger scale. She grabbed her camcorder and filmed what she saw, a formation of amber orbs moving across the sky in unison. Her footage is one of only 2 or 3 known videos of the original V formation event. The quality by modern standards is poor. This was 1997. Consumer cameras were still largely tape-based. And the compression artifacts and low light limitations of the technology made it difficult to capture what was visible to the naked eye. But the footage exists. And when Dr. Katay submitted it to various organizations for analysis in subsequent years, investigators found details in it that continue to generate questions. Dr. Katay would later put her medical career on hold for 4 years to investigate the Phoenix Lights. She eventually wrote a book on the subject, produced an award-winning documentary, and maintained for the rest of her career that what she and thousands of others saw that night was unexplained, not military, not conventional aviation, and not any kind of natural phenomenon she had ever encountered in her medical or scientific education. Others who witnessed the lights that night came from all walks of life. There were police officers who watched the formation pass over their patrol cars. There were pilots who knew aircraft intimately and said this was nothing they recognized. There were physicians and engineers and teachers. There were families standing in their backyards, children pointing upward. There was a couple who had been arguing and stepped outside to cool off and found themselves standing in silence, watching something they would describe to interviewers for the rest of their lives. Governor Five Symington, who was a former Air Force officer and experienced pilot, knew something about what aircraft looked and sounded like. Later said he had slipped away from his security detail and joined a crowd of skywatchers at Pastoa Peak, then called Squawk Peak, in the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. He watched the lights. He did not say anything publicly for a decade. It was a giant V-shape, he said in 2007. It was amazing. I've never seen anything like it. It was totally silent and it blocked out the stars. Chris McLennan, a member of the East Valley Astronomy Club, had set up her 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope that evening specifically to observe Hale-Bopp. She was a serious amateur astronomer, accustomed to looking at the sky with both the naked eye and optics. Her account, given years later in an oral history published by the Phoenix News-Time, captures something of the texture of what witnessing the lights was like for many people that night. The sense of cognitive dissonance, the struggle to fit what you were seeing into mental category that could contain it, the way the experience seemed to resist the usual shortcut and shortcuts that the mind reaches for when confronted with the unfamiliar. The witness pool also included people who were not given to extraordinary beliefs. A 911 police operator who took calls after calls that night later described the experience of listening to frightened, credible voices trying to describe something they had no language for. A truck driver on I-17 reported pulling over because something enormous was moving across the sky just ahead of him, and he wanted to watch it pass. A retired Air Force pilot who lived in the Ahwatukee community in the south part of the valley described lying in his backyard and watching the lights move slowly overhead, running through in his mind every aircraft he had ever seen or flown, and coming up empty. One detail that surfaces repeatedly in witness accounts is the emotional quality of the experience. People do not merely describe the Phoenix lights as visually unusual. They describe them as profoundly affecting. Words like awe, reverence, terror, and peace appear in the same accounts, sometimes from the same person. Whatever was in the sky seemed to produce in those who saw it not merely intellectual puzzlement, but something closer to a sense of encounter, the sensation of being in the presence of something that lies outside the ordinary categories of experience. This is not unique to the Phoenix Lights. Similar language appears in accounts of other unexplained aerial phenomena throughout history, and it appears in religious and mystical literature, and in accounts of other kinds of encounters with what might broadly be called the numinous. Whether that quality of experience reflects something real about the nature of the phenomenon, or simply something about the way the human nervous system responds to the genuinely inexplicable, is a question that nobody can currently answer. Chapter 6. The second event. The first event, the V formation traveling through the night sky, moving from Nevada down through Arizona, was mostly over by about 9 o'clock in the evening. Witnesses in the southern part of the valley and in Tucson reported seeing the lights pass and then they were gone, continuing south into Mexico and out of sight. But the night was not over. At approximately 10 o'clock, about an hour after the last reports of the moving formation had come in from the southern part of the state, a second event began over Phoenix metro area. This one was different in character, and it is this second event that produced most of the photographs and videos that would later be broadcast around the world. What people saw was a line of stationary amber lights hovering in the sky to the southwest of the city, apparently positioned over or near the Sierra Estrella mountain range. The lights were not moving. They hung in the sky, glowing steadily, and then one by one they began to go out. They did not dim gradually. They switched off sequentially from right to left until the sky was empty again. The whole sequence lasted several minutes. Michael Christen, a resident of Phoenix, captured it on video at around 10 o'clock that night. Another person about 15 miles away captured similar footage at approximately the same time. These two videos, grainy dark, but documenting an undeniable row of lights that appeared and disappeared over the mountains, would become the most widely broadcast images associated with the Phoenix Lights. The second event has a much cleaner official explanation than the first, and the explanation is widely accepted even by many people who remain skeptical about the V formation. According to the U.S. Air Force, and later confirmed by Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones of the Maryland Air National Guard, a squadron of A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, known colloquially as Warhawks, was conducting training exercises at the Barry M. Goldwater Air Force Range near Gila Bend that night. The aircraft dropped LUU-2BB illumination flares, which are parachute-equipped flares that burn very brightly for several minutes as they slowly descend. In the right conditions, and the conditions that night were right, these flares can be visible from very great distances. The sequential disappearance of the lights corresponds to the flares drifting behind the ridge of the Sierra Estrella Mountains as they descended. The mountain range from the perspective of witnesses in central Phoenix would have appeared as black absence below the lights, creating the impression that the lights were simply turning off rather than being physically hidden. Image analyst Jim Delatoso, who spent considerable time studying the available footage, ran brightness analyses across thousands of frames of video. He found that the brightness of the lights in the Phoenix Light footage remained essentially constant over time, which he argued was inconsistent with flares, which typically fluctuated in brightness as they burn. His methodology has been criticized by some analysts, in part because the 1997 era video equipment was not capable of accurately capturing subtle brightness variations and distant light sources. But his finding added another data point to the conversation. A later study examining the luminosity of LUU-2 flares at distance found that they could indeed be visible at the distance described, and that their behavior under the atmospheric conditions of that night was broadly consistent with what witnesses reported. Lieutenant Colonel Jones confirmed to the Arizona Republic in 2017 that he was one of the pilots who dropped the flares. He waited 20 years to say so publicly, citing the fact that at the time his unit was not supposed to confirm or deny specific training activities. His account is credible and specific, and it has led most serious analysts to conclude that the 10 o'clock event, the stationary lights over the Estrella Mountains, was almost certainly the illumination flares. But the 10 o'clock event and the 8 o'clock events are not the same event. They occurred at different times, involved lights with different characteristics, and generated different kinds of testimony. This distinction matters enormously, and it is the single most important reason why the Phoenix Lights remain unresolved rather than neatly explained. The official explanation for the second event is plausible and probably correct, but it tells us almost nothing about the first. Chapter 7: Operation Snowbird and the Military Explanation. The official military explanation for the first event is Operation Snowbird. Operation Snowbird was a real program. It was a pilot training exercise run primarily out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, operated by the Air National Guard. The program brought pilots from various National Guard units around the country to Arizona for training flights, taking advantage of the favorable weather in the vast, sparsely populated airspace of the desert Southwest. The Air Force eventually attributed the V formation to a group of 5 A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft. The distinctive twin-engine ground attack jet, nicknamed the Warhog, flying in a V-shaped formation at high altitude with their landing lights on, heading south toward Davis-Monthan from a northern approach. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is an ungainly, purposeful aircraft, wide-bodied, heavily armored, built around its enormous rotary cannon. It is not designed for speed or elegance. It is designed to fly slowly over the battlefield, absorb punishment, and deliver firepower to ground targets. Its maximum speed is about 430 miles per hour. Its surface ceiling is around 45,000 feet, though it typically operates much lower. It is powered by 2 General Electric TF-34 GE100 turbofan engines, each producing about 9,000 pounds of thrust. These engines are not whisper quiet. They produce a characteristic high-pitched whine that pilots and ground crews recognize immediately. A single A-10 overhead is audible from the ground. A formation of 5, depending on altitude, can be heard from considerable distance. In July of 1997, 4 months after the event, Captain Eileen Binns of the Arizona Air National Guard was assigned to investigate the Phoenix Lights. Her investigation was brief. Her conclusion matched the Operation Snowbird explanation. 5 A-10s flying information, landing lights on, high altitude. The 4-month gap between the event and the investigation is something critics have noted. Had the investigation been conducted promptly, there might have been more contemporaneous record to examine. By July, much of the immediate documentary evidence, phone records, dispatch logs, air traffic control recordings, would have been routinely overwritten or discarded. The key witness supporting the aircraft explanation is Mitch Stanley, a 21-year-old amateur astronomer living in Scottsdale, who was outside with his telescope on the night of March 13th. Stanley used a 10-inch Dobsonian mirrored reflecting telescope to observe the formation as it passed overhead. A Dobsonian in this size class is a serious instrument. A 10-inch primary mirror collects a great deal of light, and at typical planetary or aircraft observing magnifications would be more than capable of resolving the shape of a conventional aircraft against a clear dark sky. Stanley said, without hesitation, that he saw individual aircraft. He described them as having square-shaped wings, a description consistent with the A-10's distinctive broad, straight wing profile. He said it was clearly a formation of conventional jet aircraft. Stanley's mother later confirmed that he had identified the lights as aircraft on the night they appeared, before the story received any national coverage, before the USA Today front page, before the alien costume press conference, before the event became a cultural phenomenon. This pre-exposure identification is important. It means his account cannot be explained as post hoc rationalization or unconscious contamination by subsequent media coverage. He looked through his telescope on an ordinary Thursday evening, saw what he saw, told his mother it was an aircraft, and went inside. A second stargazer that night also reported seeing what appeared to be a fleet of Cessnas in formation crossing through his telescope's field of view. These are real accounts from real observers using real instruments. They cannot simply be dismissed. And there is a genuine perceptual phenomenon at work here that is worth taking seriously. When you see a V formation of aircraft at significant altitude on a dark night, the individual aircraft can, to the naked eye, appear to be part of a single coherent shape. Your visual system connects the dots. The lights become nodes, the dark space between them becomes the body of something enormous and solid. The human visual system is extraordinarily good at imposing pattern on incomplete information. It is one of the things it does best. This is not a failure or delusion. It is a feature of perception that is useful almost all of the time. The problem is that on March 13th, 1997, it may have led thousands of people to experience one thing, while Mitch Stanley, with his telescope resolving the individual aircraft, experienced another. The problem with the aircraft information explanation are real, specific, and have never been fully resolved. The first and most immediate problem is altitude and apparent size. The official explanation requires the A-10s to have been at high altitude. Cruise altitude for an interstate transit flight, which would put them somewhere in the range of 15 to 25,000 feet. At that altitude, 5 A-10s flying in V formation would subtend an angle of roughly 1 to 2 degrees of arc as seen from the ground, wide enough to be clearly visible, perhaps impressive, but not consistent with many witness descriptions. Numerous witnesses describe the formation as appearing enormous, not just large, but filling a significant portion of the sky, passing close overhead, appearing to be at rooftop level or just above the mountain ridges at the edges of the valley. A formation of aircraft at 20,000 feet cannot appear to be at rooftop levels. If it appeared at rooftop levels, it was not 20,000 feet. These two things are physically incompatible, and the official explanation requires one of them to simply be wrong. Supporters of the aircraft explanation typically argue that low-altitude descriptions reflect perceptual errors, that witnesses misjudged altitude because of the absence of familiar size cues in a dark night sky, or because the lights were brighter than expected, making them seem closer. This is a legitimate point. Altitude estimation at night is genuinely difficult, and people do make errors, but the number of witnesses who describe the object as close and the consistency and specificity of their low-altitude descriptions is difficult to wave away entirely. The second and perhaps most visceral problem is the silence. Let us sit with this for a moment, because it is the detail that most often stops people cold when they hear it. Multiple witnesses who describe the formation passing directly overhead, not at a distance, not on the horizon, but directly above them, blocking the stars, also described hearing absolutely nothing. No engine noise, no turbulence, no vibration in the air, no bass rumble that you feel in your chest before you can hear it. Nothing. A truck driver pulled over on Interstate 17 to watch something enormous pass above him in complete silence. Families standing in their backyards describe the experience as profoundly, eerily quiet. The usual ambient noise of the evening still present, the crickets, a distant dog, the low hum of the city, and then nothing from the sky, nothing at all, as whatever it was moved overhead. Police officers who track the formation through their binoculars describe the same thing. A retired Air Force pilot lying on his back in his yard watching the lights pass directly above, ran through his entire catalog of aircraft knowledge and came up empty in part because nothing he had ever flown or heard had been that silent at that apparent proximity. The silence cannot be produced by perceptual error in low light conditions. It cannot be manufactured by confirmation bias or post hoc contamination from media coverage. You either hear something or you don't. When a very large number of independent witnesses across different locations all report the same profound absence of sound, that absence is evidence of something. The aircraft explanation has a response to this. Sound propagation from aircraft is complex and high altitude dependent. At high altitude, the angle of the sound reaching the ground changes dramatically. Sound that is emitted downward from an aircraft at 30,000 feet reaches the ground at a highly oblique angle, and in certain atmospheric conditions, including temperature inversions that are common in desert environments at night, this sound can be refracted or attenuated in ways that make it far quieter at ground level than you would expect. The phenomenon is real. There are documented cases of very large aircraft passing at a high altitude that were essentially inaudible to observers directly below. But the atmospheric acoustic effect operates at high altitude. It does not operate at low altitude. The witnesses who described the object as appearing to be at rooftop level, close enough to see the underside of something, close enough that the edges of the V shape were clearly defined against the stars. Those witnesses should have been able to hear conventional jet aircraft if the object was actually where they said it was. The acoustic argument and the altitude argument pull in opposite directions. The aircraft explanation requires high altitude to explain the silence, below altitude to explain why so many witnesses describe it as close and enormous. The third problem is the trajectory and timing. The V formation moved steadily southeast across approximately 300 miles of territory over the course of roughly 90 minutes, from Henderson, Nevada, to the Mexican border. This corresponds to a ground speed of approximately 200 miles per hour, which is within the lower range of A-10 performance, but is much slower than the cruise speed you would expect from aircraft transiting cross-country between bases. A transit flight from Nevada to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson at typical cruise speed would take much less than 90 minutes. The slow, deliberate pace of the formation is consistent with many witness description of something moving almost languidly through the sky, but it is somewhat inconsistent with the operational behavior of a formation of jets on a training transit. The fourth problem is the one that is technically most frustrating: the radar data. Independent investigators, including Jim Dilettoso of Village Lab in Phoenix, attempted to obtain radar data from the FAA and from military air traffic control facilities in the Phoenix area, covering the relevant time window on the evening of March 13th. The radar data from early part of the evening, the window during which the V formation would have been visible and trackable, was reported to be unavailable, deleted, or overwritten. There are mundane explanations for this. Radar facilities routinely overwrite data after a set retention period, and if no one had flagged the data for preservation at the time, it would simply cycle off the system. There is no particular reason to preserve ordinary radar data from an unremarkable evening unless something unusual was reported. And since the unusual reports did not begin generating official attention until months later, the data may well have simply expired in the normal course of business. But the absence of that data means the most direct possible test of aircraft hypothesis cannot be performed. If the data existed and showed 5 discrete radar returns in V formation traveling southeast at the time and location witness described, the mystery would be significantly narrowed. If the data existed and showed no radar returns or something much larger and slower than A-10s, the mystery would be widened in different direction. Instead, there is simply nothing. Taken together, these four problems, altitude in apparent size, silence, trajectory, and absent radar data, do not prove that the aircraft explanation is wrong, but they represent a substantial and unresolved body of contrary evidence that the official explanation has never adequately addressed. The most intelligently honest position held by a number of serious investigators across the spectrum of opinion on this case is that the aircraft explanation may be partly correct, that A-10s may have been in the area that night, and that some of what witnesses saw may have been those aircraft, without being sufficient to explain everything that was reported. Chapter 8, 5 Symington, Francis Barwood, and the Politics of Ridicule. If the story of the Phoenix Lights had simply been a story about what happened in the sky on March 13, 1997, it might have faded from public consciousness relatively quickly. What kept it alive, what transformed it from a regional UFO sighting into a national and eventually international phenomenon, was the story of what happened on the ground in the months that followed. And at the center of that story are two politicians who could not have responded to the same event more differently: the governor of Arizona, who chose mockery, and the Phoenix City Councilwoman, who chose to ask questions and who paid dearly for it. Governor Five Symington III was the 19th governor of Arizona, then in his second term. He was a complicated figure in a complicated moment. Born into a wealthy East Coast family, educated at Harvard, a former Air Force officer who had served as a captain, he had reinvented himself in the 1970s and 1980s as a real estate developer in Arizona, parlaying the state's explosive growth into a significant business portfolio. He was a Republican with a patrician manner and a genuine affection for Arizona, and he had won re-election in 1994 on a platform of fiscal conservatism and efficient government. He was also, by June of 1997, appearing in federal court on 21 counts of extortion, bank fraud, and making false financial statements, charges related to his real estate dealings that alleged he had misled financial institutions about the values and liabilities of his business ventures. His trial was ongoing. His political future was uncertain. In the weeks after March 13th, Symington's office was deluged. Constituents were calling, writing, showing up. They had seen something, or their neighbors had, or their children had, and they wanted their governor to take it seriously. Symington later said that he had privately inquired with officials at Luke Air Force Base about whether any military exercises or unusual aircraft might explain the sightings. He says he did not receive a satisfying answer. Publicly, he said essentially nothing for 3 months. Then came the USA Today story. On June 18, 1997, the paper ran a front-page brief about the Phoenix Lights, an artist's rendering of a boomerang-shaped craft, a teaser for an inside feature. It was the ignition point. By the following morning, every national television network, every major newspaper, every morning show had picked it up. Dr. Kitai's video was everywhere. International media were calling Phoenix. The story went from a regional curiosity to a global phenomenon in roughly 18 hours, and suddenly, Symington had no choice but to respond. The response came the next day, June 19, 1997. A press conference. Reporters and citizens filed in, some nervous, some skeptical, all expecting that the governor of Arizona was finally going to address the most extraordinary mass sighting in the state's history with the gravity it deserved. What happened instead became one of the more surreal moments in the history of American political theater. Symington stepped to the podium and announced with great fanfare that his team had captured the entity responsible for the mysterious lights over Arizona. He said it with a straight face. He played it completely deadpan. The crowd leaned forward, and then his aides escorted a figure through the door in handcuffs, a figure wearing a full rubber alien costume, complete with bulbous gray head and enormous eyes. The aides removed the alien mask to reveal a very human and apparently uncomfortable Jay Hyler, Symington's chief of staff, sweating under the rubber. "This just goes to show," Symington said, smiled at the cameras as the room erupted in nervous laughter, "that you guys are entirely too serious." For a certain portion of the audience, the reporters, the skeptics, the people who had been quietly embarrassed by the whole UFO conversation, it was a relief. It gave them permission to laugh. It framed the entire episode as mass hysteria, as the kind of thing that reasonable people could dismiss with a chuckle and move on from. For the people who had actually seen something, it was devastating. It was not just a joke, it was a verdict. It said, "Your experience is ridiculous." It said, "The people in charge have considered this, and their conclusion is that it is funny." It said, "If you continue to press for answers, this is what awaits you. Not investigations, not even honest dismissal, but theater designed to make you look foolish." The press conference worked, in a narrow political sense. It effectively ended mainstream media coverage of the Phoenix Lights for years. Reporters who might have kept the story alive found it very difficult to write seriously about a subject their editors now associated with a man in a rubber alien suit. The emotional permission to laugh had been granted, and it is very hard to take something seriously once you have laughed at it. But there was someone in that political landscape who had not laughed, and who had no intention of stopping. Frances Emma Barwood was a member of the Phoenix City Council, serving as vice mayor when Phoenix Lights occurred. She was, by all accounts, a practical and serious woman, not a UFO enthusiast, not a conspiracy theorist, not someone particularly interested in the paranormal. She was an elected official whose phones had been ringing off the hook since March 14th because the constituents she represented had seen something in the sky and wanted to know what it was. It was, in the most basic sense, her job to ask. So she asked. In a city council meeting in April of 1997, she raised the question of the lights and whether anyone in the government knew what had produced them and could provide residents with an explanation. She was not making claims, she was not asserting extraterrestrial visitation, she was performing precisely the function that a city council member is supposed to perform, acting as the voice of concerned constituents before local government. She described what happened next. "I asked if anybody knew what this object was and could we check into it. I was met by a whole bunch of stares. After the meeting, a city manager came over and said quietly, 'You shouldn't have asked that question.'" Barwood did not take the hint. She continued to collect testimony. She spoke personally to approximately 700 witnesses over the following months. Every single one of them, she said, described the same phenomenon, the same shape, the same silence, the same sense of enormous low-altitude presence, the same amber or reddish-white lights. The one exception was a teenager who said he thought it was an airplane. Barwood noted with some bitterness that this was the account that official spokespeople chose to publicize and emphasize. She called for a formal investigation. She reached out to the Air Force. She wrote to Senator John McCain, who, as a Republican colleague of Symington's and a figure of immense standing in Arizona politics, had both the authority and the connections to request a military inquiry. McCain acknowledged the lights had been seen over Arizona at a 2000 press conference, but his response to Barwood's letter was to forward it to the National Archives, where it was quietly filed. The matter, from his perspective, was apparently not worth the political capital. The local press turned on Barwood with a ferocity that now seems almost baffling in retrospect. A political cartoon was published depicting her with a light switch on her forehead, with the caption, "Those mysterious lights over Phoenix, they're on but nobody's home." Other colleagues in city government allegedly distributed business cards that read beneath her name, "Speak into the tinfoil, I will hear you." She was mocked in editorials, treated as a figure of amusement at public events, and subjected to the kind of sustained informal ridicule that is extremely effective at silencing people in professional environments. It costs the mockers nothing. It costs the mocked everything. Barwood did not quietly disappear. She ran for Arizona Secretary of State in 1998. Her platform explicitly included a plank about government transparency and getting the military to account for what had been seen in the sky over Arizona on March 13, 1997. She lost. Whether the Phoenix Lights cost her the election, it's impossible to say with certainty. There were other factors, but she attributed at least part of her defeat to the public ridicule she had endured, which had made her, in the eyes of enough voters, a figure associated with fringe belief rather than serious governance. She eventually left elected politics. She was not broken by the experience. She continued to speak publicly about the Phoenix Lights for years, and her perspective on the institutional response hardened into something clear and unsentimental. The mechanism of mockery and exclusion were not accidental. They were the tools of a system that had decided for reasons of its own that this question should not be seriously asked. The ridicule was not about protecting the public from hysteria. It was about protecting the government from accountability. Meanwhile, Symington, the man who had directed the mockery, was in much more serious kind of trouble. He was convicted of bank and wire fraud in September of 1997 and resigned as governor. His conviction was later overturned on appeal by the Ninth Circuit Court, on the grounds that jurors had been improperly allowed to draw inferences from his failure to testify. He was subsequently pardoned by President Bill Clinton, his friend from their time together at Oxford, before federal prosecutors made a decision on retrying the case. He did not return to elected office. What makes the Symington story so uncomfortable to contemplate is what he said 10 years later, in 2007, when he reversed himself completely. He had not, it turned out, thought the whole thing was funny. He had seen the lights himself with his own eyes. He had slipped away from his security detail on the evening of March 13th and joined the crowd of ordinary Arizonans who had gathered to watch the comet, and then had watched something else entirely pass overhead. He had believed privately that what he saw was genuinely extraordinary, he had told his wife, and for 10 years, while Frances Barwood was being handed tinfoil business cards and watching her political career erode, the man who had staged the alien costume press conference had been carrying a private secret that directly contradicted the public mockery he had orchestrated. "I'm a pilot, and I know just about every machine that flies," he said in 2007. "It was bigger than anything I've ever seen. It remains a great mystery. Other people saw it, responsible people. I don't know why people would ridicule it." The irony is so dense, it is almost painful to look at directly. The man who had done more than anyone else to make ridicule the official response to the Phoenix Light was now saying he did not know why people would ridicule it. He attributed his decade of silence to political survival, his indictment, his trial, the impossibility of adding a UFO confession to a federal fraud defense. He said he wanted to make amends. He said the press conference stunt had not reflected his honest feelings. He wrote in a 2007 statement, "I never meant to ridicule anyone. My office did make inquiries as to the origin of the craft, but to this day they remain unanswered." Chapter 9. The Theories. Let us now lay out carefully every serious theory that has been advanced to explain the Phoenix Lights. There are more of them than most people realize, and some of them are more interesting than the simple binary of alien spacecraft versus military flares would suggest. The Phoenix Lights reward patient, careful theorizing because the evidence does not line up neatly behind any single explanation, and any honest analysis has to sit with that discomfort. The Military Aircraft Information Hypothesis. This is the official explanation. For the second event, the stationary lights at 10 o'clock, it is accepted even by many people who remain deeply skeptical about the first. The confirmed flare drop by Maryland Air National Guard A-10s at the Barry M. Goldwater Range, confirmed by Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones in 2017, accounts for the behaviors of those specific lights in a convincing way. For the first event, the hypothesis holds that the V formation was A-10 Thunderbolt IIs flying as part of Operation Snowbird, moving in formation with their landing lights on. This rests most heavily on Mitch Stanley's telescope observation and on a second independent telescopic observation that also identified conventional aircraft. Advocates point out that the angular mathematics of a high-altitude jet formation can, in darkness, produce the impression of a single vast structure to the naked eye. The visual system fills the space between the lights with implied solid mass. The strongest version of this argument acknowledges the problem, the silence, the low-altitude descriptions, the apparent size, and address them with perceptual science. Altitude misjudgment at night is common. Sound attenuations at altitude is real. The apparent size of lights in darkness is unreliable. None of the reported anomalies on this view require anything outside the bounds of known physics or known military hardware. They require only that thousands of witnesses excited by the context of the comet, primed by popular culture, and observing in conditions that are difficult for accurate perception, experienced and remember things somewhat differently from how they were. This is the position held by investigators like retired Air Force pilot James McCaha, who has said he investigated both sightings and traced them both to A-10 aircraft. It is the position the U.S. military has maintained. Where the hypothesis becomes less satisfying is when you sit with specific details. The silence, as discussed in the military explanation chapter, is not a visual impression. It is an acoustic fact. The witnesses who described hearing nothing while watching something pass directly overhead were not making a perceptual error. And the acoustic attenuation argument that explains the silence require high altitude, while the low altitude description require low altitude. These two requirements are in direct conflict, and the aircraft hypothesis cannot simultaneously satisfy both. There is also the question of witness profile. It is one thing to argue that civilian observers misidentified aircraft in the dark. It is another when the witnesses include multiple police officers who track the object through binoculars, at least 2 trained pilots who specifically say it was unlike any aircraft they knew, a retired Air Force pilot who ran through his entire professional catalog and came up empty, and ultimately the governor of the state, an Air Force veteran himself, who privately concluded that what he saw was not of this world. The quality of the witness pool matters, and simply attributing all of them to perceptual error at night requires accepting that a very large number of professionally trained observers all failed in the same specific way at the same time. The deliberate misdirection staged narrative theory. This theory occupies an interesting middle ground. It does not necessarily require extraterrestrial craft. It requires only that some part of the US military or the governmental apparatus chose to frame the public narrative around the flares in away from the first event. The mechanism proposed is not that the second event was fabricated from nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Jones has confirmed that his unit did conduct a training exercise that night, and there is no reason to doubt this. But the theory holds that when the Phoenix Lights story exploded nationally 3 months later, the military exploited the coincidence of the flare drop to redirect public attention. Look at these lights, which we can explain, and stop talking about the V formation that preceded them by 2 hours, which we cannot explain. The lumping of both events under a single umbrella explanation, the Phoenix Lights were military flares, accomplishes this even if it is factually misleading about the first event. The 4-month delay before any official explanation was offered is notable. If the A-10s were simply conducting a routine training exercise, confirming that fact in response to public inquiries should have been a matter of days, not months. Military public affairs offices routinely confirm training activities. The delay is at minimum consistent with an institution figuring out what narrative to adopt, rather than simply confirming what it had already done. Frances Barwood's experience adds further texture. She wrote to the Air Force requesting information about the lights. She received no meaningful response. She wrote to Senator McCain requesting he demand a military inquiry. He forwarded her letter to the National Archives. If the answer was simply, A-10s and flares, here's our training log, the response to Barwood's direct request should have been easy and prompt. The non-response is consistent with either bureaucratic indifference or something more deliberate. Which of those is true is impossible to determine from outside. The secret military prototype hypothesis. Among those skeptical of the aircraft formation explanation, but not inclined toward extraterrestrial conclusions, the most compelling alternative is that the Phoenix Lights were a classified military aircraft, a prototype or black budget platform being tested over the desert Southwest. The history of American military aviation makes this less far-fetched than it might seem. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was operational by 1956, but not publicly confirmed until one was shot down in 1960. The SR-71 Blackbird flew classified missions for years. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter was operational from 1983, but not publicly acknowledged until 1988. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was in development through the 1980s, with capabilities classified for years after its public reveal. The RQ-170 Sentinel drone was photographed by civilians at Kandahar long before the Air Force acknowledged its existence. Secret aircrafts are not theoretical. They are a documented feature of American military history. Classified programs with performance characteristics far beyond acknowledged technology have repeatedly turned out to be real. The specific platform most often proposed in connection with the Phoenix Lights is the TR-3B, sometimes called the Black Manta or Astra. This designation does not appear in any declassified document. Its primary source is a man named Edgar Fouch. Edgar Rothschild Fouch was born in 1948 in Americus, Georgia, and served 20 years in the United States Air Force as an electronics and cryptographic systems specialist, a technical background that gave his later claims at least a surface plausibility within the relevant engineering domain. He worked at several major installations, including Edward Air Force Base in California, where he was involved in flight operation testing and evaluation on aircraft, including the F-111, F-15, A-10, and the original B-1 bomber. He was also stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, which sits adjacent to the Nevada Test and Training Range, and is the nearest major base to the Groom Lake facility, Area 51. According to records that supporters have shared online, Fuchs had a temporary duty assignment at the Air Force Designates AFFTC TED 3, the Groom Lake facility, from June to August 1979. This is the kernel of verifiable biography that sits beneath everything else he would later claim. In August 1998, Fuchs gave a presentation at the International UFO Congress that made him briefly famous in UAP research circles. He described the TR-3B as a large, triangular black aircraft developed under a classified program he called the Aurora Program, a program whose existence has been rumored since the late 1980s, when budget documents appeared to reference it, though it has never been officially confirmed. Fuchs said the TR-3B was approximately 600 feet across, roughly twice the wingspan of a Boeing 747. He described its propulsion system in considerable technical detail. A circular accelerator ring he called the magnetic field disruptor, filled with pressurized mercury plasma, spinning at 50,000 RPM, generating a magnetic vortex that he claimed reduced the craft's effective gravitational mass by approximately 89%. This mass reduction was what allowed the craft to maneuver silently at low speeds while also being capable of hypersonic flight. The plasma field itself acting as a buffer against atmospheric friction and radar detection. 3 conventional multi-mode thrusters at the triangle's corners provided directional control and were capable, he claimed, of accelerating the craft to Mach 9 below 120,000 feet. He also wrote a semi-autobiographical novel called Alien Rapture, published in 1998, which he described as containing thinly veiled real events from his career, a common technique in the insider disclosure community for getting information out while maintaining plausible deniability. How credible is any of this? The honest answer is not very on the specific claim, though the biography itself has some verifiable foundation. Fuchs was never able to produce documentation confirming the TR-3B's existence. The propulsion system he described, mercury plasma at those specifications generating gravitational effects, has no basis in published physics, and no independent engineer has been able to validate the underlying science. His account was based not on personal observations of the TR-3B itself, but on what he said a friend at Groom Lake had described to him, which is several layers removed from direct evidence. And, in an interesting internal contradiction, Fuchs was publicly dismissive of Bob Lazar, another former Groom Lake employee who made similarly extraordinary claims about reverse-engineered alien propulsion, calling Lazar a liar and a possible disinformation agent. This is the kind of mutual debunking that is common in the insider disclosure community, and that makes it exceptionally difficult to evaluate any of the individual claims on their merits. Fuchs died in Texas in May 2017, never having produced physical evidence for his claims, but also never publicly recanting them. He remains a figure in an awkward intermediate category, too technically specific and biographically rooted to be dismissed as straightforward fantasy, too unverifiable and secondhand to be taken as reliable testimony. What is worth separating out is the general category of claim from the specific messenger. The TR-3B, as described by Fuchs, may well be fiction, but the broader existence of large, silent, triangular classified aircraft is not inherently implausible. In the fact that the same description, the same general shape, and silent and low altitude behavior surfaces in reports from Belgium, the Hudson Valley, and Phoenix across a roughly 15-year period is a coincidence that the secret aircraft hypothesis handles better than most. The general category of claim is at minimum worth taking seriously as a hypothesis, even if Fuchs himself is not a reliable narrator. What makes the classified prototype theory attractive for the Phoenix Lights is that it would account for several anomalous features. The extraordinary science, a platform designed for low observability, might use propulsion that produces no conventional engine signature. The apparent size, experimental platform can be built to unusual scales, and the government's interest in not investigating publicly, not to conceal alien contact, but to conceal the program. It also accounts neatly for why official spokespeople gave incomplete and somewhat evasive answers. The answer was true as far as it went. There were A-10s in the area, but was not the complete picture. The theory's weaknesses are if you were conducting covert testing of a classified aircraft, flying it over Henderson, then Prescott, then metropolitan Phoenix, the sixth largest city in America, on an evening when hundreds of thousands of people were outside with their heads raised toward the sky, would be a spectacular failure of operational security. The desert Southwest has vast unpopulated regions specifically suited to classified testing. The Nellis Range Complex, the Barry M. Goldwater Range itself, the White Sands Missile Range. These are exactly the kinds of places you test classified aircraft precisely because nobody is there to watch. The route the Lights took that night was the opposite of a covert test profile. In the theory, like all claims about classified programs, is inherently unfalsifiable. Any absence of evidence can be attributed to classification effectiveness. The extraterrestrial visitation hypothesis. This is the theory most immediately associated with the Phoenix Lights in popular culture, and the one most quickly dismissed in polite company. That dismissal is often a kind of reflexive social positioning rather than genuine engagement with the evidence. The extraterrestrial hypothesis deserves careful evaluation. Start with the scientific context because it is easy to lose sight of how strange and significant that context is. The observable universe contains something in the neighborhood of 2 trillion galaxies. Our own galaxy, the Milky Way, holds somewhere between 100 and 400 billion stars. Data from the Kepler Space Telescope, which stared at a small patch of sky for 4 years and cataloged the dimming pattern of stars as planets crossed in front of them, found planets to be extraordinarily common. So common that astronomers now estimate most stars host at least one, and that the Milky Way likely contains tens of billions of planets in the habitable zones of their stars, where liquid water is possible. The universe has been running for roughly 13.5 billion years. Earth and its 4 billion year experiment in biology are not early arrivals. By cosmic standards, we are middle-aged at best. This is where the Drake equation enters, a formula developed by astronomer Frank Drake in 1961 as a way to structure thinking about the number of communicating civilizations that might exist in the galaxy. Drake's equation multiplies together estimates for the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of those planets that develop life, the fraction where life becomes intelligent, the fraction that develop technology, and the length of time such civilizations survive. the inputs are deeply uncertain, but across a wide range of conservative estimates, the equation tends to produce answers that are not zero, not even close to zero. Carl Sagan estimated there could be millions of communicating civilizations in the Milky Way. More conservative estimates suggest thousands. Even deeply skeptical versions of the calculation, plugging in very low probabilities for the development of intelligence, tend to produce at least a handful across the history of the galaxy. And yet, the silence. The radio telescopes have been listening since 1960, when Drake pointed an 85-foot dish at two nearby stars and heard nothing. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has been scanning the sky systematically for more than 6 decades. No confirmed signal. The Fermi paradox, named for physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked over lunch in 1950, "Where is everybody?" remains one of the deepest unresolved questions in science. The universe is old enough and large enough that a civilization which arose even a billion years ago, a blink in cosmic time, would have had time to colonize the entire galaxy at modest sub-light speed. But we see no evidence of colonization, no megastructures, no Dyson spheres, no signal in any frequency, just silence. There are many proposed resolutions to the Fermi paradox, and researchers debate them seriously. Perhaps life is vastly rarer than the Drake equation suggests, the rare Earth hypothesis, which argues that the specific conditions required for complex life are so improbable that we may be genuinely alone or nearly so. Perhaps intelligent civilizations reliably destroy themselves before they can spread, the Great Filter hypothesis, which raises the uncomfortable question of whether we are on the near or far side of whatever typically kills civilizations. Perhaps interstellar travel is so difficult that no civilization has achieved it at a meaningful scale. Perhaps they are here, but we lack the sensory or conceptual apparatus to recognize them. Perhaps they are communicating, and we have not yet learned how to hear. The extraterrestrial hypothesis applies to the Phoenix Lights does not require you to resolve the Fermi paradox. It requires only that at least one civilization somewhere in this very large and very old galaxy has managed interstellar travel and has found its way to this particular planet. The improbability of this, viewed against the scale of the universe, is actually quite modest. What would be truly astonishing, statistically speaking, is if among the hundreds of billions of star systems in a galaxy that has been running for billions of years, not one other civilization has ever reached spacefaring capability. With that context established, consider what the Phoenix Lights witnesses actually reported, and what it would imply about the technology involved if the extraterrestrial hypothesis is correct. The craft, if it was a craft, was enormous, consistently estimated at between a third of a mile and a mile across. No aircraft built by any publicly acknowledged human program comes close to that scale. The largest aircraft ever built, the Antonov AN-225, has a wingspan of just under 90 meters. Even the most extreme classified programs produce platforms measured in tens of meters, not thousands. If the Phoenix Lights represented a single physical structure of the reported size, it was built by someone with an approach to engineering that is categorically different from anything in the human inventory. It was completely silent. This is, from an engineering standpoint, perhaps the most significant detail. Every known means of generating lift in atmosphere, jet engines, propellers, rotors, even the aerodynamic interaction of a wing moving through air, produces sound. The quietest aircraft ever built still produce audible noise at close range. a structure reportedly as large as a mile across, moving through dense low-altitude atmosphere at observable speed, producing not even a low-frequency pressure wave that witnesses might have felt rather than heard, implies either a propulsion mechanism with no analog in human physics, or, if it was at very high altitude, a perceptual situation quite different from what witnesses described. Former Pentagon official Luis Elizondo, who ran the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program ATIP, described the positive lift without visible mean of propulsion as one of the defining characteristics of the most anomalous UAP cases. Objects that maintain altitude with no visible wings, no exhaust, no rotor wash, no sound. The Phoenix lights, on the hypothesis that they were a single craft at low altitude, are a textbook example of this characteristic. Elizondo developed what he called the 5 observables, a framework for categorizing the behavior of genuinely anomalous UAP, drawing on the case files ATIP had assembled. The 5 are: positive lift without visible propulsion, sudden or instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity without signatures such as sonic boom or heat trails, low observability, meaning the ability to evade or avoid radar detection, and transmedium travel, meaning movement between air, water, and space without loss of performance. The Phoenix lights, as reported, demonstrate at minimum the first and third of these: the apparent gravity-defying silence and the rapid movement across 300 miles of territory at speeds witnesses could not reconcile with what they heard. Whether they demonstrate others is unclear from the available evidence. Now consider the behavioral pattern. One of the threads that runs through the most serious extraterrestrial hypothesis research is the question of where and when anomalous craft tend to appear, and whether there is a discernible pattern to their apparent interest. The answer that emerges from decades of military UAP case files, and this is a genuine observation from researchers across the skeptics to believer spectrum, is that UAP encounters cluster around specific locations and contexts: nuclear facilities, military installations, areas of significant strategic importance, and densely populated urban areas. The Phoenix case fits the latter. The lights passed over the metropolitan area containing 3 million people at the kind of altitude and speed that ensures they would be seen. Whether this represents deliberate visibility, something choosing to be observed, or simply the statistical reality that densely populated areas generate more witnesses for any aerial phenomenon, is genuinely impossible to say. But it is a feature of the case that proponents of the ET hypothesis find significant. There is also Dr. Edgar Mitchell to consider. Mitchell was the 6th person to walk on the moon, the lunar module pilot of Apollo 14, and the holder of a doctorate in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT. He was, by any measure, one of the most technically accomplished human beings of the 20th century, a man who had personally navigated to another world and back, who understood orbital mechanics and spacecraft systems at the level of someone who had bet his life on them. After his spaceflight, Mitchell founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences and spent the remaining decades of his life investigating consciousness, anomalous experience, and, specifically, the evidence for extraterrestrial contact. He concluded, on the record and in detail, that the evidence was compelling and that official suppression of it was real. He spoke specifically about the Phoenix lights as a significant case. He died in 2016, a year before the New York Times story about ATIP, that in some ways validated the direction his post-astronaut life had taken. You can disagree with Mitchell's conclusion. You cannot honestly dismiss them as the product of an undisciplined or credulous mind. He brought to the question the same rigorous attention to evidence that had kept him alive in deep space, and his answers, arrived at over decades of careful inquiry, was that something non-human had been present in our airspace, and that the institutions responsible for investigating it had chosen not to. Image analyst Jim Delatoso contributed a technical dimension to the Phoenix-specific case. Working at Village Labs in Phoenix, he conducted frame-by-frame brightness analysis on the available video footage across thousands of frames and found that the intensity of the lights remained essentially constant, a characteristic inconsistent with flares, which fluctuate as they burn, and inconsistent with conventional aircraft landing lights, which varies with angle and atmospheric conditions. He also found color composition signatures in the Phoenix Lights footage that differed from comparison footage of known flares. Delatoso's methodology has been challenged, primarily on the grounds that consumer video technology in 1997 was not capable of accurately capturing subtle brightness variations in distant light sources, and that objection is technically legitimate, but his findings have not been definitively refuted. They add a small, contested, but non-zero technical dimension to the case. The weaknesses of the extraterrestrial hypothesis are that there is no physical evidence, no recovered material, no ground trace, no instrument anomalies from an independent source. The one witness who observed the formation through a serious optical instrument identified conventional aircraft. In the general epistemic principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is not just a skeptic's maneuver. It is a safeguard with a long invalidated history in science. Humanity has been wrong about extraordinary things before in both directions, concluding that something was inexplicable when it was not, and concluding that something was explained when it wasn't. What can be said is this: the extraterrestrial hypothesis applied to Phoenix Lights cannot be ruled out by the available evidence. It is consistent with most of what witnesses reported. It is consistent with the behavior of the most anomalous UAP cases documented by military investigators. And it sits with the scientific and cosmological context, the actual scale of the universe, the actual age of the galaxy, the actual mathematics of planetary habitability, that makes the existence of non-human spacefaring intelligence not just possible, but by some reasonable estimates, likely. Whether that intelligence has visited this particular planet on this particular evening in 1997 is a question the evidence cannot yet close. The mass misidentification hypothesis. A version of skeptical analysis that goes further than the aircraft formation explanation holds that the Phoenix Lights were not a single coherent event, but a collection of unrelated aerial phenomena. Commercial flights at unusual angles, the ambient lights of communities seen from distance, private aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, and possibly the Hale-Bopp comet itself for some observers, all woven into a single narrative by witnesses sharing information and by media coverage that imposed a coherent story on disconnected data. This theory has an intellectual appeal. We know there are dozens of aircraft over Arizona on any given evening. We know that lights at distance in darkness are hard to classify. We know that the media coverage, which began in earnest 3 months after the event, provided a strong interpretive frame that could have shaped how witnesses subsequently remembered their observations. But the theory has a fatal weakness: the consistency of contemporaneous testimony from people who had not yet been exposed to any media narrative. The calls to Prescott police at 8:17 p.m., the former officer in Paulden, tracking the formation at 8:15 p.m. with binoculars. The witnesses across the valley describing the same shape, same direction, same silence, same amber color, all in real time before any narrative existed to conform them. The consistency of what people said immediately without any shared frame of reference is very difficult to explain through mass misidentification. Something specific was in the sky, something consistent enough that hundreds of independent observers in different cities through different instruments describe the same thing. The mass psychological phenomenon hypothesis. Implicit in some dismissive commentary is the suggestion that the Phoenix Lights were fundamentally a psychological event, that the cultural saturation of 1997, the X-File at its peak popularity, Roswell mythology freshly reinvigorated, Heaven's Gate still on every front page, primed a large number of people to interpret ordinary things as extraordinary, and that social contagion did the rest. This theory fails on the same grounds as mass misidentification. Mass suggestion shapes interpretation. It does not produce independent, consistent, specific descriptions of the same unusual phenomenon from people who have yet compared notes. The witnesses who called police in multiple cities on the evening of March 13th were not yet part of any shared narrative. They were describing something in the moment. They were describing it the same way. What is worth acknowledging is the cultural context's role not in causing the experience, but in shaping how it was subsequently processed, reported, and remembered. A V formation of lights in 1987 might have been described differently. The specific vocabulary of spacecraft, UFO formation, the mental categories available to witnesses as they tried to explain what they had seen, were all deeply shaped by the cultural moment. This is not the same as saying the experience was fabricated. It is saying that all human experience is culturally mediated, including authentic, anomalous experience. The theory then forms a spectrum. At one end is the official explanation: aircraft, flares, perceptual error, tidy and institutional, imperfect but rational. At the other end is extraterrestrial visitation, vast in implication, handling some evidence better than the official explanation, but requiring a leap in the physical evidence alone does not yet justify. In between are the classified prototype hypothesis, the deliberate misdirection theory, and the mass misidentification hypothesis, each capturing something real without fully explaining it. The honest position, the intellectually defensible position, is that the Phoenix Light remains an open case. Any single explanation adopted with total confidence is probably adopted for reasons that go beyond what the evidence alone can support. Chapter 10. The Science of Seeing. Before we leave the question of evidence, it is worth a serious detour into the science of human visual perception and eyewitness memory, not to dismiss what witnesses said, but to understand the full context in which their testimony should be evaluated. Human visual perception is not a camera. The eye does not simply record what is in front of it and transmit a faithful image to the brain. Vision is an active, constructive process in which the brain takes incomplete and often ambiguous sensory information and builds a coherent representation of the world, filling in gaps, making assumptions, applying prior experience, and constantly updating its model. This process happens automatically, below the level of conscious awareness, and it produces results that are almost always accurate enough for the purposes of everyday life. But in situations where the sensory stimulus is genuinely unusual, where the brain has no well-established category to fit the incoming data into, the constructive nature of perception becomes more visible and more potentially unreliable in specific ways. Night viewing is one of the situations where perception is most prone to these effects. In low light, the eye switches from cone-based to rod-based photoreception, which is more sensitive but lower resolution and entirely colorblind. The ability to judge distance and size accurately at night is significantly degraded relative to daylight. A bright light source at night is particularly difficult to place spatially. Brightness can create the impression of proximity, so a very bright object at great distance can appear to be a dimmer object at close range. This is one reason why Venus, often the brightest object in the sky other than the sun and moon, is one of the most commonly reported UFOs in history. It simply looks wrong to people who encounter it unexpectedly. Former F-16 pilot Ty Groh noted when discussing the Phoenix Lights that extremely bright objects can appear closer than they are in reality. He also noted that flares in the sky behave like hot air balloons, drifting with the wind, and that a strong gust could propel all of them at once at a uniform distance, creating an appearance of coordinated movement. Eyewitness memory adds another layer of complexity. The work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus over the past several decades has demonstrated thoroughly that human memory is not a recording, but a reconstruction, one susceptible to post-event suggestion, leading questions, and the influence of subsequent information. Witnesses who gave testimony months or years after the Phoenix Lights may have had their memories shaped by news reports they saw in the interim, which includes artists' renderings of the formation and extensive media descriptions. This happens automatically without conscious awareness, and honest witnesses can have genuine, sincere memories that have been partly shaped by subsequent exposure to information about the event. None of this means the Phoenix Lights witnesses are lying or fabricating. It means that careful evaluation is warranted, and that the most dramatic specific claims about altitude, size, and solid structure are exactly the claims most susceptible to perceptual error in low light conditions. But the perceptual science cuts both ways. The witnesses who say the object was silent are not reporting a visual impression. Sound at night in a quiet desert suburb is conspicuous. Its absence is equally conspicuous. If a formation of A-10 jet aircraft had flown low enough to appear to block the stars over residential neighborhoods, the engine noise would have been impossible to miss. Glass rattling, unmistakable, the kind of sound that wakes sleeping children. That many witnesses specifically note the silence and describe it as remarkable is significant precisely because silence cannot be manufactured by the visual system. You either hear something or you don't. And this brings us back to the fundamental tension that no explanation has yet fully resolved. The tension between Mitch Stanley's telescope and the testimony of thousands of witnesses who describe something solid, silent, enormous, and low. Both accounts appear to be honest, both appear to be accurately remembered, and they cannot both be simply right. Unless, of course, there was more than one thing in the sky that night, which, as we have already seen, is very possibly true. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The weeks and months after March 13, 1997, were not easy for most of the people at the center of the story. Dr. Kate, who had years of photographic evidence and video footage, remained largely silent for several years, identifying herself publicly only as a physician witnessed. She has said that the decision to come forward cost her professionally and personally, that being publicly associated with a UFO event, even as a credible witness rather than a credulous believer, exposed her to the kind of soft ridicule that follows people in professional settings. So many people are afraid to come forward because they are so ostracized, she said years later. She eventually made the choice to step back from her medical career and investigate and document the Phoenix Lights full time, writing her book in 2004, and producing her documentary in 2005. Those projects brought her into contact with hundreds of other witnesses who had been similarly silent, similarly afraid, and similarly transformed by what they had seen. The transformation is a recurring theme in witness testimony. People who saw the lights describe not just the event itself, but its aftermath, the way the world felt different afterward, the way the sky never looked quite the same, the way they found themselves checking the horizon in the evenings. Some describe it in spiritual terms, as an expansion of what they thought was possible. Others describe it in terms of a deep unease. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of the Phoenix Lights is that the experience did not generate a uniform response. Some witnesses felt wonder, some felt fear, some felt a kind of calm they couldn't explain. Whatever was in the sky that night, its effect on the people who saw it was personal and lasting. Frances Barwood's experience was perhaps the most politically costly. She was a practical, pragmatic, elected official who had approached the Phoenix Lights not as a UFO believer, but as a public servant responding to constituents' concerns. Hundreds of her constituents had called her office. They were frightened. They wanted answers. She simply had asked in a city council meeting whether anyone knew what the object was and whether it should be investigated. She was met with silence, then ridicule, then a systematic campaign of mockery that eventually ended her political career. She ran for Arizona's Secretary of State in 1998 and lost. She later reflected that her experience was a lesson in how institutions protect themselves from disruptive questions, not through active suppression, but through the social mechanism of ridicule and exclusion. Making someone look foolish is cheaper than investigating what they saw. Chapter 12. The Decade of Silence. For about 10 years after the Phoenix Lights, the story existed in a kind of limbo. It was famous. Art Bell, the legendary host of the overnight radio program Coast to Coast AM, called it the second biggest case in ufology after Roswell. It had entered popular culture. References appeared in The X-Files, and it was embedded in the larger mythology of the 1990s UFO moment, alongside Roswell, Area 51, and the parade of sightings and claims that had become part of the cultural backdrop. But it had no new information, no new witnesses of note, no resolution. It was a story that everyone knew but nobody could close. Then, in 2007, on the 10th anniversary of the sighting, Five Symington gave a series of interviews in which he reversed everything he had said in public a decade earlier. The man who had staged the alien costume press conference, the man who had told reporters that they were entirely too serious, the man who had been the public face of official dismissal, now said plainly and without equivocation, he had seen the craft. He had seen it with his own eyes. It was enormous. It was silent, and it blocked the stars. It was, he believed, not of this world. I'm a pilot, and I know just about every machine that flies, he said in an interview. It was bigger than anything that I've ever seen. It remains a great mystery. Other people saw it, responsible people. I don't know why people would ridicule it. He explained his decade of silence in terms of the political situation he had been in at the time. He was under federal indictment when the story broke. He was about to stand trial. He did not need the additional instability of being the governor who said he had seen a UFO. He told only his wife. The press conference stunt was, he now said, a calculated attempt to diffuse public anxiety. A spoof, he called it, not a reflection of his actual beliefs or experience. I never meant to ridicule anyone, he wrote in a 2007 statement. My office did make inquiries as to the origin of the craft, but to this day they remain unanswered. The Symington reversal was significant not because it was proof of anything. One man's testimony, however credible, is not scientific evidence, but because of what it said about the cost and incentives that shape public discourse about unusual phenomena. Here was a man with impeccable credentials, Air Force officer, experienced pilot, two-term governor. He had witnessed something he believed was genuinely anomalous, and he had spent 10 years publicly mocking the very people who were trying to talk about what he privately knew to be real, because the political cost of honesty was too high. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of UFO sightings. Credible witnesses, pilots, military officers, law enforcement, scientists, routinely see things they cannot explain and routinely stay quiet about them because the social cost of speaking up is too high. The few who do speak up pay for it. Ridicule, career damage, and formal exclusion from the professional circles that once welcomed them. The Phoenix Lights are perhaps the most vivid example of this pattern because the witness who stayed silent the longest was not an anonymous farmhand, but the governor of the state where it happened. Chapter 13. Subsequent Sightings and the Question of Pattern. One of the more under-discussed aspects of the Phoenix Lights story is the degree to which the core experience, large, silent, low-altitude craft moving in V or triangular formation over populated areas, witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people, generating official explanations that witnesses find unsatisfying, has been reported not just over Arizona, but in Texas, Belgium, the Hudson Valley of New York, and elsewhere in the world, across decades before and after 1997. When you place the Phoenix Lights inside this broader pattern, something becomes clear. Whatever was seen over Arizona was not a unique event. It was perhaps the most dramatic and best documented instance of a phenomenon that appears to recur. The Phoenix area before and after 1997. Dr. Katay's own experience, as described earlier, extended well before March 13, 1997. She photographed oval orbs over her home in 1995 and filmed what she described as a mile-wide group of lights hovering over Phoenix Sky Harbor's restricted airspace in January of 1997, 2 months before the mass sighting. She has maintained for decades that the 1997 event was not an isolated incident, but part of a continuing pattern of activity over the Phoenix area. In April of 2008, mysterious lights appeared over Phoenix again, generating a flurry of calls and media coverage that briefly recalled the original event. This time, the mystery was solved quickly. A Phoenix resident came forward to say that a neighbor had tied road flares to helium balloons and released them from his backyard at 1-minute intervals. A police helicopter pilot confirmed the balloons and flares explanation as consistent with what witnesses had seen. The 2008 incident was a deliberate hoax. This is actually an important data point for reasons that work in two directions. In one direction, it is a reminder that unusual lights in the sky sometimes have mundane explanations, and that 1997 style formations can be fabricated with materials available at any hardware store. In the other direction, it demonstrates by contrast how utterly different the 1997 event was in its character and scale. A hoax mounted from one person's backyard does not produce 300 miles of consistent witness reports across multiple states. It does not generate testimony from Police officers in Prescott and Paulden and Dewey Humboldt and Phoenix, all independently tracking the same object at the same time. It does not produce a governor who privately concludes he witnessed something non-human. The 2008 incident and the 1997 event resemble each other only superficially, and the contrast illuminates just how extraordinary the original was. Stephenville, Texas, January 8, 2008. Just a few months before the Phoenix balloon hoax came an event that deserves to be far better known than it is, and that bears a remarkable resemblance to the Phoenix Lights in its broad structure: mass sighting, credible witnesses, military denial followed by reversal, and uniquely, radar data that supports the witness accounts. On the evening of January 8, 2008, the small town of Stephenville, Texas, about 100 miles southwest of Dallas, became briefly the center of the world's attention. Stephenville is a dairy farming community, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place where nightfall brings actual dark skies. Just after 6 o'clock in the evening, residents began reporting something extraordinary: a massive, silent aircraft moving across the town, described variously as having bright white lights in a horizontal arc, then vertical parallel lines, then shifting formations that no conventional aircraft could produce. Steve Allen, a freight company owner and licensed pilot who knew aircraft intimately, described what he saw as roughly a mile long and half a mile wide. He estimated it was moving at approximately 3,000 miles per hour. A county constable, a business owner, and several other residents filed reports. Multiple witnesses described seeing military jets appear after the object, apparently in pursuit. The jets chasing something that then accelerated away at speeds they could not match. The Air Force, when contacted by journalists, initially denied having any aircraft in the area that evening. The denial was prompt and categorical. It held for approximately 2 weeks. Then, on January 23, 2008, the Air Force reversed itself. Officials from the 301st Fighter Wing at Naval Air Station Joint Reserve Base Fort Worth admitted that 10 F-16 fighter jets had been conducting training exercises in the region on the night of the sighting. They had been there the whole time. Their initial denial was simply false. The parallels to the Phoenix Lights are immediate and obvious. Initial event witnessed by hundreds of people, including trained pilots and law enforcement. Official denial. Media pressure building. Eventual admission that military aircraft were present, but an explanation that witnesses found wholly inadequate to account for what they had actually seen. Pilots and police officers who are intimately familiar with F-16s do not mistake them for a silent, mile-wide craft moving at 3,000 miles per hour. But the Stephenville case has something the Phoenix Lights do not: corroborating radar data. The Mutual UFO Network filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FAA and obtained primary radar data from 5 different antennas covering the Central Texas region on the night of January 8th. MUFON investigators, Glenn Schultz and Robert Powell, the latter a nanotechnology engineer with a meticulous, methodical approach to analysis, produced a 77-page report on their findings. Powell and Schultz first identified and tracked the routes of the 2 confirmed F-16s, which had transponders and were therefore clearly visible in the radar data. Once the military aircraft were accounted for, they went looking for other radar contacts in the area, contacts without transponders. What they found was an unidentified object moving at speeds of up to 532 miles per hour, performing maneuvers inconsistent with any conventional aircraft and heading in the direction of the Crawford Ranch, which was at the time the weekend home of President George W. Bush, and one of the most heavily protected pieces of airspace in the country. The unknown object appeared on multiple radar installations simultaneously. It was not a ghost return, not a weather artifact, not an equipment anomaly. It was a real object in the sky, tracked on government radar without a transponder, doing things that known aircraft do not do. The military jets on the radar data never got close to the unknown object. If they were scrambled to intercept it, they failed. The object eventually disappeared from radar without conventional explanation. The Stephenville case thus sits in a unique position in the landscape of mass UFO sightings. It has most of the elements that make the Phoenix Lights compelling: credible mass witnesses, trained observers, military denial then reversal, but it also has independent, government-collected radar data that cannot be explained as perceptual error or misidentification. The radar does not hallucinate. The radar saw something. What it was, nobody has officially said. The Hudson Valley Wave, 1982 to 1986. Before Phoenix, before Stephenville, there was the Hudson Valley. Between 1982 and 1986, approximately 5,000 eyewitnesses reported seeing large, silent, V-shaped or boomerang-shaped craft with multicolored lights flying low over the Hudson Valley of New York, roughly an hour north of New York City. The first report came from a retired police officer in Kent, New York, on New Year's Eve 1982, who initially thought he was looking at an aircraft until it passed over his house in absolute silence at a speed far too slow for any fixed-wing plane to maintain. That quality, moving too slowly and quietly to be any airplane, but clearly structured and illuminated, became the defining characteristic of the Hudson Valley reports across 4 years. The witnesses were not marginal or credulous. Among them were security personnel at the Indian Point nuclear power plant, who watched the object hover over the facility for an extended period, astronomers, engineers, police officers, people who watched it through binoculars and described the lights as arranged on what appeared to be a single solid structure. The reports were collected and investigated by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had been the U.S. Air Force's scientific consultant for Project Blue Book, and who later became one of the most rigorous academic investigators of UAP phenomena, and his colleague, Phil Ambrogno, who published their findings in a book titled Night Siege: The Hudson Valley UFO Sightings. The eventual skeptical explanation proposed for at least some Hudson Valley sightings was a group of ultralight aircraft pilots from Stormville Airport who admitted to flying in formation at night for fun, their strobe lights creating the impression of a single large craft. Some of the sightings were attributed to this group, but Hynek and Ambrogno and many witnesses were not satisfied that the Stormville pilots explained all of the reports, particularly those involving hovering at low altitude and vertical movement that conventional aircraft cannot perform. The Hudson Valley Wave, like the Phoenix Lights, ended inconclusively. The Belgium Wave, November 1989 to April 1990. If the Phoenix Lights are the most widely witnessed UAP event in American history, the Belgian Wave of 1989 to 1990 is its closest international counterpart, and in some ways, the most technically compelling mass sighting event anywhere in the world, because it is the one in which a national air force, officially and publicly engage with the phenomenon, scrambled fighter jets, obtained radar locks, and then admitted it could not explain what it had found. The wave began on November 29, 1989, when two police officers on patrol near Eupen in eastern Belgium, close to the German border, reported seeing a large flat triangular craft with bright lights hovering at low altitude over a field. Within days, dozens of reports had come in from across Belgium. Within weeks, hundreds. Over the next several months, through the winter of 1989 and into the spring of 1990, more than 2,000 formal reports were filed from witnesses including police officers, military personnel, airline pilots, and ordinary civilians. The descriptions were consistent to a degree that investigators found remarkable. A large, flat, triangular, or boomerang-shaped object with bright white lights at the corners and a flashing red or orange light at the center, moving slowly and silently at low altitude. In all material respects, what Belgian witnesses described in 1989 and 1990 is indistinguishable from what Arizona witnesses described in 1997. The Belgian Air Force took the reports seriously enough to act on them. This is itself notable. It sets the Belgian wave apart from most other UAP events, in which national militaries have either denied any knowledge or refused to engage publicly. The Belgian Air Force coordinated with civilian researchers, shared radar data, and ultimately scrambled F-16 fighters. On the night of March 30th to 31st, 1990, an estimated 13,500 people watched as F-16s attempted to intercept the triangular craft that had been detected on ground radar. What happened next is documented in official Belgian Air Force record and has been publicly discussed by Major General Wilfred de Brouwer, who commanded the operation. The F-16 pilots made 9 attempts to lock their radar onto the target over the course of about an hour. They achieved radar locks, and then on each occasion, the object performed a maneuver that broke the lock, accelerating from approximately 150 miles per hour to over 1,100 miles per hour in a matter of seconds, while simultaneously dropping from 9,000 feet to near ground level, maneuvers that would be physiologically fatal for any human pilot and that are incompatible with any known aircraft of any nation. No visual contact was made by either pilot. The ground witnesses confirmed the jets were overhead. The object, whatever it was, simply outperformed military interceptors on their own radar while remaining invisible to the pilots. Major General de Brouwer, after his retirement, wrote, "The Belgian UFO wave was exceptional, and the Air Force could not identify the nature, origin, and intention of the reported phenomena." He also noted, with evident frustration, the social cost paid by witnesses. Some witnesses who made reports in 1989 are still hounded and discredited to this day. Several witnesses didn't dare to reveal their name. Some didn't even take the risk of reporting their sightings. General de Brouwer knew 2 people personally, a journalist and a NATO employee, who verbally described what he called sensational sightings but refused to put anything in writing because the professional risk was too high. The mechanism of ridicule and exclusion that ended Francis Barwood's career was not unique to Arizona. The Belgian wave has never been explained. The F-117 Nighthawk, the only classified American aircraft with broadly triangular geometry that was operational at the time, has a wingspan of about 64 feet and produces clearly audible engine noise. It cannot hover, it cannot accelerate from 150 to 1100 miles per hour in seconds. It does not match what Belgian witnesses or Belgian radar described. No other known aircraft does either. Ohio, 2 cases 3 decades apart. Ohio is the site of 2 of the most well-documented law enforcement UFO encounters in American history, separated by nearly 30 years. And because one of them, the 1994 Trumbull County incident, was made famous on Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, if you have spent any time listening to late night radios in the 1990s or early 2000s. But let's talk about the older case first. On the morning of April 17, 1966, just east of Akron in Portage County, Sheriff's Deputy Dale Spur and Mounted Deputy Wilbur Neff had stopped to investigate an abandoned car on Route 224 around 5 in the morning. From a nearby wooded area, a light appeared, then rose, and revealed itself to be a metallic, disc-shaped object that lit up the scene around them. In Spur's word, like high noon. The object hovered briefly overhead, then began moving east. Spur's sergeant, monitoring the radio, ordered them to follow it. What followed was an 85-mile pursuit across the Pennsylvania state line, one of the longest police chases of a UFO on record, as Spur and Neff raced after the object in their cruiser. Other officers monitoring the radio joined in. A patrolman from East Palestine, Ohio, who had been parked at an intersection the pursuing deputies would have to pass, watched the object go by with the sheriff's car in pursuit and fell in behind. At the Pennsylvania border, a convoy officer joined as well. 4 officers from 2 states in multiple vehicles, all tracking the same object. Spar reported hearing radio traffic about military jets being scrambled to intercept. The object, which had been staying ahead of the pursuing vehicles, as if aware of them, eventually stopped, hovered while the officers watched, then accelerated upward and vanished. Project Blue Book investigated. Their official conclusion was that the officers had been chasing the planet Venus and a communication satellite. This explanation was received with considerable skepticism, not because Spar was a trained observer who had spent years on night patrol, but because the object had been moving at speeds and in directions inconsistent with a fixed celestial body. Spar, unlike most of his colleagues, spoke publicly about the encounter. It cost him his marriage, his job, and eventually his health. He died in 1985, having spent the intervening years largely unable to escape the event that had defined him. The Portage County chase is generally believed to have been one of the inspirations for the police pursuit sequence in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounter of the Third Kind. The 1994 Trumbull County incident is different in character, less a pursuit than a sustained multi-agency encounter, but it shares the essential quality that makes both Ohio cases remarkable. The central witnesses were trained law enforcement officers, and the entire event was documented in real time on dispatch recording that still exists. Shortly after midnight on December 14, 1994, 911 dispatcher Roy Ann Rudolph at the Trumbull County Emergency Center in Warren, Ohio, began receiving calls from residents reporting strange lights in the sky. Low-flying, silent, unusual. Rudolph initially dismissed the first calls. Then the volume became impossible to ignore, and she dispatched officers from Liberty Township to investigate. Sergeant Toby Mellorow was the first officer on scene. What he reported back over the radio was not a conventional aircraft. He described a large, pulsating light, unlike anything he recognized, moving in ways that did not match any aircraft he knew. His conversation with the dispatch operator, recorded in full on tape in real time, captures the quality of confusion and controlled alarm that characterizes the best law enforcement UAP encounters. A professional trying to describe something accurately for which he has no accurate description. Lieutenant James Baker of the Brooksfield Township Police Department, monitoring the calls, decided to get a better look and climbed an abandoned radar tower near his position. From the top of the tower, he saw not one object but three, arranged in a triangular formation, the middle object positioned slightly higher than the two flanking it. He reported that the three objects changed colors in unison: red, yellow, blue, green. Their synchronized color changes implied coordination or a single system. He reported this over the radio. Over the course of what would become a roughly 6-hour event, officers from 5 separate law enforcement agencies in Trumbull County and surrounding areas witnessed the object. Some officers reported that their police cruisers stalled inexplicably while in proximity to the lights, engine failures in vehicles with no prior mechanical issues, which resumed normal function after the objects moved away. Other officers reported beams of light that appeared to engulf their vehicles. The Youngtown Air Reserve Station, the nearest military installation, was contacted. Captain John Keatak responded that no aircraft, experimental or otherwise, had been flying that night. The incident never made local news. The officers involved, with few exceptions, chose not to speak publicly, having observed what happened to people in similar situations. The case circulated in UFO research communities for years before Art Bell devoted a segment of Coast to Coast AM to it in 1999, introducing the actual dispatch recording to a national audience for the first time. The recordings are striking documents. You can hear the dispatchers going from skeptical to attentive to something that sounds like controlled unease as the reports pile up and the officers' voices change quality. Whatever was in the sky over Trumbull County that night, the people tasked with responding to it did not know what it was, and their real-time recordings of not knowing are among the most credible primary documents in the American UAP case record. The 1994 Trumbull County incident has never been explained. The official explanation that the officers were misidentifying stars appearing low on the horizon does not account for the police car stall, the beam reports, the synchronized color changes, the multi-agency visual confirmation, or the fact that the objects were tracked moving across the landscape rather than remaining fixed in the sky as stars would. When you lay these cases side by side, Portage County, Trumbull County, Hudson Valley, Belgium, Phoenix, Stephenville, several things stand out. The description of the object is remarkably consistent across cases separated by decades and thousands of miles. Large, triangular or V-shaped, slow at low altitude, completely silent, with distinctive light configurations. The social and institutional response is almost consistent. Initial official dismissal or denial, mounting public pressure, eventual partial admission that doesn't fully account for the reports, and significant personal cost for those who pushed for investigation. The radar data, in the cases where it exists, Belgium and Stephenville most clearly, shows objects behaving in ways that cannot be attributed to known aircraft, and in none of these cases has a final, complete, fully satisfying explanation been provided. This pattern does not prove that the same phenomenon was responsible for all of these events. It may be that multiple different phenomena produce similar experiences across different times and places, but the consistency is striking enough that serious investigators, including those working inside official government channels, have noted it. The ATIP program that the Pentagon ran from 2007 to 2012, in which the New York Times revealed in 2017 collected and analyzed reports from military and civilian sources going back decades, and its investigators were specifically looking for exactly this kind of cross-case pattern. What they found, and what has been acknowledged by officials like Luis Elizondo, who ran the program, was a consistent set of flight characteristics: instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity without a sonic boom, low observability, apparent anti-gravity behavior that recurred across cases from different era, different countries, and different observational contexts. Whatever was in the sky over Phoenix on March 13, 1997, was not unprecedented. It had been seen before, and it has been seen since, over rural Ohio at dawn, over the Hudson Valley in the small hours, over the farms of Belgium, over dairy country in Texas. The Phoenix Lights are just one chapter in a story that is still being written. Chapter 14, Roswell, History, and Where the Phoenix Lights Fit In. To understand the cultural weight of the Phoenix Lights, it helps to understand where they sit in the broader history of UFO incidents in the United States, because that history is longer, stranger, and more institutionally complicated than most people realize. The modern era of UFO sightings in America is conventionally dated to June 24, 1947, when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. Arnold described them as moving like a saucer would if you skipped it across water, and a journalist's paraphrase of that description produced the phrase flying saucer, which became part of the English language essentially overnight. The Arnold sighting generated a wave of similar reports across the country in the weeks and months that followed, a wave so large that the U.S. military felt compelled to formally investigate, eventually producing a series of programs: Project Sign, Project Grudge, and most famously Project Blue Book, which operated from 1952 until 1969, and investigated more than 12,000 reported sightings. Of those, 701 were classified as unidentified in the final official record, cases for which no conventional explanation could be found. 2 weeks after Kenneth Arnold's sighting came Roswell. On July 8, 1947, Public Information Officer Walter Haut issued a press release on behalf of Roswell Army Air Force in New Mexico, announcing that the Air Force had recovered a flying disc. Within hours, the story had been walked back, replaced by the official explanation of a weather balloon. The material recovered was later identified in a 1994 Air Force report as debris from Project Mogul, a classified program that used high-altitude balloons to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. Regardless of what was actually at Roswell, a question that remains contested, the back and forth between the initial announcement and the subsequent retraction established a template that would define the public relation between the U.S. government and UFO reports for the next 7 decades. Initial disclosure, rapid reversal, official dismissal, and persistent public skepticism. The Phoenix Lights fit squarely into this template. It was not an anomaly in American history. It was a recapitulation of a pattern that has been repeating itself with variations since 1947. What makes them unusual within that pattern is their scale. Most significant UFO incidents are reported by a handful of witnesses. Roswell involved a rancher and a few military personnel. The Rendlesham Forest incident in the United Kingdom in December 1980, often called Britain's Roswell, involved personnel at two neighboring RAF bases over several nights. The Phoenix Lights involved, by most conservative estimates, thousands of witnesses across hundreds of miles, generating hundreds of police calls, at least several video recordings, and sustained media attention that went national and then international. If you were designing an incident that would be maximally difficult to simply ignore, you would design something like the Phoenix Lights. The UFO researcher and historian Richard Dolan has written about what he calls the secrecy apparatus, the set of institutional practices, formal and informal, that have consistently operated to prevent serious official investigation of unusual aerial phenomena. Dolan's analysis is sometimes criticized as too credulous toward conspiracy narratives, but the basic structural observation is difficult to dispute. There is a consistent pattern across decades of official dismissal combined with private acknowledgement by the very officials doing the dismissing that the reports deserve attention. The Phoenix Lights are perhaps the single clearest example of this pattern, precisely because Fife Symington eventually said so himself. Arizona has its own particular place in this history. The state has been among the highest per capita generators of UFO reports in the country for decades. The National UFO Reporting Center lists over 4,000 sighting reports from Arizona in its historical database, a figure that places it consistently in the top 10 states nationally. Whether this reflects something genuinely anomalous about Arizona's airspace, or simply the density of military activity, or the combination of clear skies and a large outdoor-oriented population, or some mix of all three, is unclear. There is also an older layer to this: the indigenous cultures of the Southwest, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Akio-Okadam, the Yavapai, among others, have their own traditions about beings from the sky, about encounters with non-human intelligence, about craft or phenomena that appear in the night sky and defy ordinary description. These traditions are ancient, varied, and not monolithic. Different nations have very different relationships with these stories, in different degrees to which they connect them to the contemporary UAP discourse. But they are worth acknowledging because they represent the deepest available stratum of human experience of watching the Arizona sky and encountering something unexpected there. The Hohokam align their walls toward the sky for reasons archaeologists still argue about. Chapter 14. The Modern Context. The story of the Phoenix Light does not end in 1997 or in 2007. It has continued to evolve, and the broader context in which it is evaluated has changed significantly in the years since. In December 2017, the New York Times published an investigation that revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, which has been investigating unexplained aerial phenomena since 2007. The program had been funded at roughly $22 million per year, mostly at the behest of then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, a state with its own deep history of unusual aerial phenomena. The revelation that the U.S. government has been officially and secretly investigating UFOs, now called UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, was surprising to most people, including most journalists and most members of Congress. The New York Times story was accompanied by the public release of 3 videos shot by U.S. Navy aircraft showing encounters with objects that behave in ways that Navy pilots could not explain, moving at extraordinary speed, making instantaneous direction change, and apparently operating without any visible means of propulsion. The Navy later confirmed that the videos were authentic. In the years that followed, the floodgates began to open somewhat. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment of UAP that acknowledged 144 cases that could not be explained, while confirming that a small number involved technology that demonstrated advanced capabilities relative to known U.S. or foreign systems. The Navy pilots, who had captured the famous Tic Tac video, showing an object moving at extraordinary speeds and making instantaneous direction changes off the coast of California in 2004, gave detailed testimony about their encounters. Commander David Fravor, the lead pilot in the Tic Tac incident, said plainly that he had no explanation for what he had seen, and that it demonstrated performance characteristics far beyond anything in the U.S. or known foreign military inventory. In 2022, NASA formed its own UAP study group, commissioning a team of independent scientists to evaluate the available evidence and recommend approaches for future investigation. Their report, released in 2023, was careful and measured, acknowledging that the vast majority of UAP reports have conventional explanations, but that a small subset resists conventional explanation and deserves serious scientific attention. This was the first time NASA had formally addressed the subject, and the very fact of its doing so was a marker of how dramatically the institutional landscape had shifted. In 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Gersh testified under oath before Congress that the U.S. government was in possession of non-human craft and biological material, and that this information was being actively concealed not just from the public, but from congressional oversight itself. Grush cited protections under federal whistleblower statutes and said he had been authorized to make his disclosure through proper channels. His testimony was extraordinary, not because it was necessarily true, but because it was made under oath by a credentialed former intelligence official in a formal congressional hearing. Whether his claims will eventually be verified, refuted, or simply absorbed into the ongoing ambiguity that characterizes this subject, it presents a kind of institutional moment that would have been unthinkable in 1997 when Frances Barwood was being handed a tinfoil business card for asking essentially the same questions. In 2024, a House Oversight Committee hearing on UAPs featured additional testimony from retired military officials and former government insiders. Retired Navy Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, former Defense Department official Luis Elizondo, and former NASA Associate Administrator Michael Gold all spoke about what they characterize as a deeply dysfunctional system for handling UAP information, one in which crucial knowledge was siloed in classified programs that lacked proper congressional oversight, and in which witnesses and investigators faced systematic disincentives for honest reporting. Elizondo, who had run the Pentagon's ATIP program, said that the program had been deliberately kept small and underfunded because powerful institutional actors within the Department of Defense were hostile to serious investigation of the subject. None of this constitutes proof of anything in the strict scientific sense. The claims are extraordinary and the evidence presented publicly remains fragmentary. Institutional acknowledgement that a problem exists is not the same as institutional understanding of what the problem is, but the landscape has shifted dramatically from the one that existed in 1997. In this new context, the Phoenix Lights look different, not necessarily more explained, but differently situated. They are no longer a cultural curiosity, a punchline from the late 90s. They are now part of a much larger and more serious conversation about what the United States government knows about unusual aerial phenomena and what it has chosen to share. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, the Pentagon's current UAP tracking office, has reportedly been going back through historical case files that include sighting from the 1940s onward. Whether the Phoenix Lights will eventually find their way into an official record of unresolved events, or whether some future declassification will produce a satisfying conventional explanation, is impossible to say. What can't be said is that the people who saw the lights on March 13, 1997, and who were mocked and dismissed for saying so, have lived long enough to see the world catch up to the seriousness of their experience, at least partially. That is not nothing. It does not answer the question of what was in the sky, but it is a kind of vindication, quiet and incomplete, for the people who paid a price for asking. Chapter 15. What Remains. So what do we actually know? After 28 years of investigation, argument, testimony, official explanation, and renewed inquiry, what can we say with reasonable confidence? We know that on the evening of March 13, 1997, a large number of people, somewhere between 10,000 and several 100,000, depending on whose estimates you accept, observed unusual aerial phenomena over a roughly 300-mile corridor stretching from Henderson, Nevada to southern Arizona border. We know that these observations spanned roughly 3 hours, involved 2 distinct events with different characteristics, and were made by witnesses whose testimony is, taken as a whole, extraordinarily consistent. We know that the second event, the stationary lights at 10 o'clock, was almost certainly LUU-2 illumination flares dropped by A-10 aircraft from Maryland Air National Guard during training exercises at the Barry M. Goldwater Range. This is confirmed by the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones, supported by video analysis showing the lights disappearing behind the Sierra Estrella ridgeline, and consistent with the known behavior of parachute-equipped military flares in those atmospheric conditions. This part of the story at least has an answer. We know that the first event, the V formation that traveled hundreds of miles through the night, has no explanation that accounts for all the evidence. The best available official explanation is the formation of A-10 aircraft flying as part of Operation Snowbird, as identified through a telescope by Mitch Stanley. This explanation is plausible and cannot be ruled out, but it is contradicted by a substantial body of testimony from trained observers who describe the object as low, enormous, and completely silent, characteristics inconsistent with high-altitude jet aircraft in the configuration described. The tension between these two bodies of evidence has not been resolved. We know that the radar data from the first event is unavailable, removing one of the most direct possible means of resolving the question. We know that Five Symington, Air Force officer, trained pilot, 2-term governor, privately witnessed something he believed to be extraordinary, publicly mocked those who reported it, spent a decade in silence, and then reversed himself completely, saying on the record that what he saw was not of this world. We know that the people who pushed hardest for official investigation paid for it. Frances Barwood in her political career, Dr. Katay in her medical one, and dozens of anonymous witnesses in the slower currency of professional reputation and social standing. The mechanisms of ridicule and exclusion that process this story are worth studying not as evidence of conspiracy, but as documented institutional reflex, the way large systems tend to manage information that doesn't fit their existing categories. We know that the broader context has changed. The United States government now officially acknowledges that there are aerial phenomena it cannot explain, that some of them demonstrate capabilities beyond known technology, and that they warrant serious scientific investigation. Programs like Arrow exist. Credentialed officials have testified under oath. The conversation has moved, however haltingly, from the margins toward the center. What we do not know is what was in the sky over Arizona on the evening of March 13, 1997, not with the kind of evidence that closes a question for good. And so, we are left with that opening, and if you are willing to sit in it rather than rush to fill it with a comfortable answer in either direction, it becomes one of the more interesting places a person can find themselves. Consider what the universe actually is. The observable portion alone contains something in the range of 2 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy holds hundreds of billions of stars. Many of those stars, we now know, host planets. The Kepler Space Telescope alone confirmed over 2,000 of them, and statistical extrapolation suggests that the Milky Way may contain tens of billions of planets in the habitable zone of their stars. The number of opportunities for life over the 13-odd billion years the universe has been running is so large it barely responds to language. And yet, as far as we can tell, sitting on this particular rock, we have never received a confirmed signal, never made confirmed contact, never found a single unambiguous piece of evidence that anyone else is out there. This is the Fermi paradox, and it is one of the strangest facts about the position we are in. The universe is old enough and large enough that if intelligent life arises with any regularity at all, the galaxy should by now be saturated with it, with its signals, its artifacts, its traces. The silence should be impossible, and yet the silence, as far as we can hear, continues. There are many proposed resolutions. Perhaps life is rarer than we assume. Perhaps intelligence tends to destroy itself before it can spread. Perhaps the distances are simply too vast, the timescales too mismatched, the physics of communication across light years too unforgiving. Perhaps they are here, and we are not equipped to recognize them. Perhaps the universe is full of signals we have not yet learned to read. The Phoenix Lights do not resolve the Fermi paradox. They are not proof of anything, but they are a reminder of what it would mean if the answer to the paradox is not silence, but presence, not absence, but proximity. If something non-human has found its way to this corner of the galaxy and has been, for whatever reason, moving through our skies, then the implications are not merely scientific. They are civilizational. They concern what we are, where we fit, what the story we have been telling ourselves about being alone, and unprecedented and at the forefront of intelligence actually amounts to. Most of the witnesses who saw the Phoenix Lights did not think about any of this in the moment. They stood in their backyards or on their patios or on the shoulder of an Interstate 17, and they looked up and they saw something they could not explain, and they felt, by their own accounts, something they could not name, something between awe and fear and recognition. The sensation, several of them said, of being seen. The sensation may have been nothing more than the human nervous system doing what it does when confronted with the genuine unfamiliar, reaching for categories, finding none, generating a feeling of significance to fill the gap. That is a real phenomenon. But it is also worth sitting with the other possibility, that what hundreds of thousands of people felt looking up at something silent and vast moving through the dark above them was a response to something real, that the oldest question has an answer, and that the answer has occasionally been close enough to see without a telescope.